Dear viewers, on January 7th, 2026, as the world watched the United States threaten a NATO member with military force, Canada gave a masterclass in diplomatic leadership. 48 hours after President Trump declared that he reserved all rights, including military force, regarding Greenland, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood shoulder to shoulder with Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen in Ottawa, confirming a truth obvious to any democratic country. Territorial sovereignty is non-negotiable. This was not showy diplomacy. Canada was emphasizing a principle that has governed the post-1945 international order, that borders are not subject to the whims of powerful neighbors, that alliances have meaning, and that small countries deserve the protection of international law. The contrast could not have been more stark. While Washington sent officials to threaten occupation, Ottawa reaffirmed sovereignty by hosting its allies. One administration spoke of conquest, the other of cooperation. The question before us today is not whether Canada made the right choice, but how this situation reveals Canada's role as a stabilizing force in an increasingly unstable world. To understand the significance of the Carney-Frederiksen meeting, we must first understand what precipitated it. On January 6, 2026, President Trump renewed his long-standing interest in acquiring Greenland, an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. This was not his first such expression. He had proposed purchasing Greenland during his first term, to considerable international ridicule. But this time, the rhetoric escalated dramatically. White House officials, including senior advisor Stephen Miller, suggested that military options were on the table. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated explicitly that the United States reserves all rights, including invading Greenland. For context, Greenland is home to approximately 57,000 people, predominantly indigenous Greenlanders. It has been part of the Danish realm since 1814, with substantial autonomy since 1979. Denmark is a founding member of NATO, having joined in 1949. The idea that one NATO member would threaten another with invasion represents a fundamental rupture in the alliance structure that has maintained European security for 75 years. Prime Minister Carney's response was swift and unambiguous. Within 24 hours, he had extended an invitation to Prime Minister Frederiksen. Within 48 hours, she was in Ottawa. The joint statement they issued was remarkable, not for its rhetorical flourishes, there were none, but for its absolute clarity. Canada will always support the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Denmark, including Greenland. This is the diplomacy that Canadians of a certain generation will recognize. It recalls Lester Pearson's steady hand during the Suez Crisis, when Canada positioned itself as an honest broker capable of defending principle without inflammatory rhetoric. It recalls Pierre Trudeau's assertion that Canada would pursue its own foreign policy, even when that meant disagreeing with larger powers. It is the tradition of a country that believes international law exists for a reason, and that reason is to prevent exactly this kind of predatory behavior. What makes this moment particularly significant is the broader context of Arctic geopolitics. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global average, opening new shipping routes and access to natural resources. Russia has been militarizing its Arctic territories for over a decade. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and has ambitions for a polar Silk Road. Into this already complex strategic environment, the United States now introduces the prospect of territorial conquest. Canada, as an Arctic nation with the world's longest Arctic coastline, has immense stakes in how Arctic sovereignty questions are resolved. If the principle of might makes right is allowed to govern Arctic affairs, Canada's own territorial integrity could be threatened. This is not hypothetical alarmism. President Trump has on multiple occasions made comments suggesting Canada should become part of the United States. Each time, these comments were dismissed as jokes or negotiating tactics. But when the same administration openly discusses invading Greenland, those comments must be reassessed. The Carney government understands this. By standing with Denmark, Canada is not merely defending a friend, though that alone would be sufficient justification. Canada is defending the principle that will protect Canada itself, that sovereignty is not subject to coercion, that alliances are meaningful, and that international law applies even to powerful states. This is why the Carney-Frederiksen meeting matters. It is not merely a symbolic gesture. It is Canada articulating a foreign policy doctrine for the 21st century. Sovereignty is non-negotiable. Alliances are sacred, and Canada will stand with any nation, large or small, whose territorial integrity is threatened. Let us examine what Canada has actually accomplished through this diplomatic intervention and what it signals about Canada's strategic direction under Prime Minister Carney. The most immediate achievement is the reaffirmation of NATO solidarity. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization's Article 5 states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. But what happens when the threat comes not from an external adversary, but from within the alliance itself? This is unprecedented territory. Prime Minister Carney has provided an answer. Canada will stand with threatened allies regardless of who is making the threat. The joint press conference on January 8th was revealing. When asked about Greenland's future, Prime Minister Frederiksen stated clearly that the future of Greenland and Denmark are decided solely by the people of Denmark and Greenland. Prime Minister Carney's response was equally direct. He said he had nothing to add, that he agreed completely, and that Canada and Denmark are very close allies and friends. This is not the language of equivocation. This is not both sides have a point diplomacy. This is Canada drawing a clear line. Danish sovereignty over Greenland is not debatable. Beyond this immediate demonstration of alliance solidarity, Canada is positioning itself as a defender of international law more broadly. Consider Canada's parallel support for Ukraine. On January 2, 2026, Prime Minister Carney announced he would travel to Paris for peace negotiations regarding Ukraine. Canada has committed over $23.5 billion in assistance to Ukraine since Russia's invasion, making it one of the largest contributors relative to GDP. The parallel is deliberate. Russia invades Ukraine, violating territorial sovereignty. The United States threatens Greenland, violating territorial sovereignty. Canada's position in both cases is identical. Territorial integrity is not negotiable. This consistency gives Canada moral authority that the United States has now forfeited. Consider the diplomatic implications. When Prime Minister Carney meets with President Xi Jinping in China from January 13th to 17th, 2026, he does so as the leader of a country that has demonstrated it will defend sovereignty principles even against its most important ally. When he addresses the World Economic Forum in Davos from January 19th to 21st, he does so representing a country that practices what it preaches regarding international law. This is soft power of the highest order. Canada is simultaneously pursuing an Arctic strategy that combines military strength with diplomatic engagement. The Carney government has committed to dramatically expanding Canada's Arctic presence. This includes increasing Canadian Armed Forces presence in the Arctic to ensure year-round operations across land, sea, and air. Major investments in Arctic community infrastructure are underway. Enhanced surveillance and monitoring capabilities are being deployed. Partnerships with other Arctic nations, Norway, Iceland, Finland, Sweden, and now explicitly Denmark, are being strengthened. According to the 2025 budget, Canada will reach NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target by March 2026, a full year ahead of the previous timeline. By 2035, Canada aims to reach 5% of GDP on defense, a target that reflects the dramatically changed security environment. These are not abstract commitments. The Royal Canadian Navy has already increased Arctic patrol frequency by 40% since March 2025. The Canadian Armed Forces have established a permanent presence at CFS Alert, the world's northernmost permanently inhabited place. These are tangible demonstrations of sovereignty, but perhaps the most significant long-term strategy is economic diversification. Prime Minister Carney's upcoming visits to China, Qatar, and Switzerland are not merely trade missions, they are security strategy. Canada currently exports approximately 75% of its goods to the United States. The Carney government has set an explicit goal to double non-US exports within 5 years. This is not anti-American policy, this is pro-Canadian policy. A country whose economic survival depends on a single customer is not truly sovereign. Canada is diversifying because diversification is sovereignty. The numbers are already moving in the right direction. In the third quarter of 2025, non-US exports grew by 12% year over year. New trade agreements are under negotiation with Qatar in energy and infrastructure. Expanded agreements with the European Union through participation in the SAFE initiative were announced in December 2025. Deepened partnerships with Japan and South Korea on critical minerals and technology are being formalized. These partnerships represent more than economic opportunity, they represent strategic optionality. Perhaps most importantly, observe what Canada has not done. Canada has not issued threats. Canada has not engaged in bombastic rhetoric. Canada has not questioned anyone's mental fitness or used insulting language. Canada has simply stated principles and acted on them. This is the calm strength that Canadian diplomatic tradition embodies. When Prime Minister Frederiksen thanked Canada for its support, she specifically referenced the respect of our common values, the only values where you can build a global world society on. This is the language of alliance among equals, not domination and submission. The United States may have more aircraft carriers than Canada, but Canada has something the current US administration lacks: credibility. And in diplomacy, credibility is its own form of power. The inevitable objection from defenders of the current US administration runs as follows. Canada is being naive. The Arctic is strategically vital. China and Russia are expanding their presence. Greenland's location makes it essential for US security. Sometimes, national security requires tough decisions, and allies should understand that. Let us address each component of this argument with the seriousness it deserves. First, no one disputes the Arctic's strategic importance. Canada, as the nation with the longest Arctic coastline, understands this better than most. The question is not whether the Arctic matters, but whether territorial conquest is an acceptable method for securing strategic interests. The answer, in any framework that respects international law, is no. Second, regarding Chinese and Russian Arctic expansion, the appropriate response is to strengthen alliances, increase defense cooperation, and build Arctic infrastructure within existing sovereign territories. Canada is doing exactly this. The inappropriate response is to threaten a NATO ally, thereby weakening the very alliance structure meant to counter Russian and Chinese ambitions. If NATO fractures over Greenland, Putin and Xi are the only winners. Third, the national security requires tough decisions argument. Here is the cruel irony. Threatening Greenland does not enhance US security, it undermines it. Denmark now has legitimate reason to question its alliance with the United States. Other NATO members are watching and drawing conclusions about American reliability. Arctic nations are reassessing their security partnerships. The United States has made itself less secure, not more. But let us take the argument at its most charitable interpretation. Suppose, hypothetically, that Greenland's geography truly is vital for US security. Even then, there are mechanisms available. Treaties, basing agreements, joint defense arrangements. These are how alliances function. What there is not, what there cannot be in any civilized international order, is unilateral seizure of allied territory. The fundamental problem with the Canada is naive argument is that it assumes might makes right, that sovereignty is conditional on power, and that alliances are meaningful only when convenient. If these become the governing principles of international relations, no country is secure, least of all smaller nations like Denmark, or even middle powers like Canada. Canada is not naive. Canada is defending the only framework in which Canada can be secure. That is not idealism, that is strategic realism. Distinguished viewers, we are witnessing a pivot point in Canadian history. The Carney-Frederiksen meeting was not merely about Greenland, just as Canada's support for Ukraine is not merely about one country's territorial integrity. These are affirmations of the principles that have kept the peace since 1945. Sovereignty is inviolable, alliances are sacred, and might does not make right. Canada is emerging as the defender of these principles, not because we are the largest nation, nor the most powerful militarily, nor the wealthiest economically. Canada leads because we understand something that has been temporarily forgotten in Washington. A rules-based international order benefits everyone, especially those who are not superpowers. Prime Minister Carney has articulated a vision of Canada as a country that builds alliances, diversifies partnerships, strengthens defenses, and defends principle. This is not revolutionary. This is Canadian foreign policy at its best, in the tradition of Pearson and Trudeau. The road ahead will not be easy. Standing on principle when your largest trading partner is behaving erratically carries costs. But some things are worth the cost. Sovereignty is one, dignity is another. And the belief that we are not just a resource to be extracted or territory to be acquired, that we are a nation with agency, values, and the determination to defend both. Canada stood with Denmark. Canada stands with Ukraine. Canada will stand with any nation whose sovereignty is threatened. Not because it is easy, but because it is right. Thank you for watching.